Yeah, lights are really... Okay. Ćao. Evo, ne moram ništa diram, ništa. A gde je neki sat? Običali su mi neki sat na koji ću... Ok. Na kraju treba da kažeš da će biti closing remarks. I da ostanu, da se ne razilaze. Pošto neće biti, i da nema pauze. Nema pauze i mi samo da se klonimo, i mi samo da se siđemo s podijama. I stići ti Morten ostaje, pošto je on isto na closing remarks. I Pernilo se pridružuje. Ok. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the second session of academic panel today at the Belgrade Security Forum. My name is Jelena Redoman, and I will be chairing and discussing today's papers, which will discuss also EU crisis responsiveness in terms of various conflict and post-conflict settings. We have 4 distinguished speakers who will bring on their all individual regional expertise and findings from their field works, discussing some of cross-cutting issues you've been already had in position to hear this morning, but also bringing novelty mostly in terms of specifics of particular case studies they've been working on. I'm a PhD candidate at the Faculty of Political Sciences and visiting PhD fellow with the Swedish Defense University, and I will be chairing today's session as it follows. Firstly, I will give short introduction to who our panelists are today. Then each of them will be given 10 minutes of time to present their papers, after which I will give some of my thoughts as feedback to their papers, which will they have a second round as an option to respond before the floor is given to you and your questions. So I have great pleasure to introduce Ms. Chiara Loschi, who is a postdoc researcher at the Institute of Integration European Research at the University of Vienna. Ms. Loschi has regional expertise in Libya and Tunisia, and she will bring on that in a few minutes while discussing her findings. Our second speaker today is Mr. Enver Ferhatović, who is research fellow at the Center for Transitional Studies, Security and Foreign Policy. He has a background in political sciences and Islamic studies, and he has been serving in a number of senior positions for a number of international organizations working in crisis areas, so I guess he's the right person to be speaking on this panel today. Our third speaker is Mr. Morten Bøås, who is a research professor at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs and is scientific co-director of Horizon 2020 UN PEC project. Mr. Bøås has a background in political economy and regional expertise in Africa and Middle East. And finally, our fourth speaker is Mr. Vsevolod Samokhvalov, who used to hold Maria Curie lectureship at University of Liège and now is professor at Vesalius College with a background in Russian and Black Sea studies. So, Ms. Loschi, floor is yours for the next 10 minutes, after which I will be discussing each paper respectively.
Okay. Thank you, Hilda. Thank you very much. And yes, my name is Chiara Loschi. I am postdoc at the University of Vienna and the Institute for European Integration Research. And I'm presenting a paper that I co-authored with Alessandra Russo, research fellow at Sant'Anna School of Advanced Studies and postdoc researcher at Sciences Po Bordeaux in France. For this postdoc, for this paper, I've been a postdoc and living in Tunisia in the last 18 months. And the French Institute for the Contemporary Maghreb Research. And this is part of the Horizon 2020 program that has been mentioned before. And this paper focuses on the cases of Libya and Ukraine. The paper analyzes the uses of EU border management and the strategies in the framework of the crisis response in the southern and eastern neighborhood, using the cases of Libya and Ukraine, which stand out as the conflict at the gates of Europe. Our main argument in the paper is that the period 2013-14 to 2016-17, EU crisis response intervention in the two countries have reflected the EU concerns for stabilizing its neighborhood with a view to mitigating tensions and flows that have a political impact within the EU itself. In both cases, the liberal trajectories of state-building intervention that characterized the EU effort during the past 2 decades seem to be giving way to new responses that are often designed in the light of principled pragmatism that has been mentioned this morning. The waves generated by the color revolutions first and the Arab upheavals later have called into question at different times and different latitudes the transformative capacity of the ENP and the crisis management procedures. In 2015, the revised European neighborhood policy identified stabilization as its main political priority, and the following EU global strategy prompted the establishment of a coordination cell within the European External Action Service devoted to prevention of conflicts, rule of law, security sector reform, integrated approach, stabilization, and mediation. Within this framework, the EU emphasis on classical state attributes such as borders and reliable monopoly of force asserted through effective border control and security sector reform programs represents a significant analogy between Libya and Ukraine. The deployment of border management instruments in the two countries appears to follow different trajectories in terms of both design and implementation. This preliminary observation may suggest that the EU is somehow successful in overcoming its long debated and criticized one-size-fits-all approach. However, this state of affairs is far from being tested, and accordingly, the paper interrogates the extent to which such differentiation in border management concepts, policies, and practices promoted. It signals the injection of more conflict sensitivity and context specificity on the part of the EU response. In fact, we wonder whether a differentiation may be explained as the outcome of growing political and institutional fragmentation within the EU. That is to say, the replacement of the transformative power mantra with new stabilization templates that may mirror a turn towards more realpolitik and perhaps weaker strategic consistency due to the underlying divergence of interest among member states. The paper is divided in two parts. The first part focuses on policy design and its shortcomings, and the second part is mostly on the perception of such shortcomings by the respondents and the targets of such EU response. The main finding of the first part is that the role of the EU generally appears to be weak and it lacks context sensitivity for two main reasons. First, member states had diverging political interests vis-à-vis their neighborhoods, and second, internal inconsistencies and intra-institutional fragmentation led the EU crisis response to be shaped more by bureaucratic logics than by strategic considerations. To make an example, in the case of Ukraine, the 2014 political framework for crisis approach defined the response to the crisis in terms of EU political interest by stressing the importance to normalize relations with Russia while creating conditions for a stabilized security situation through the enhancement of Ukrainian authorities' capacity in the field of internal security. The document paved the way for the creation of the civilian CSDP mission in support of security sector reform in Ukraine, which is known as the EU Advisory Mission for Civilian Security Sector Reform. However, the mission was established in a context where a former EU border assistance mission to Moldova and Ukraine was deployed, and it was operating since 2005. This mission appeared to be not only as an instrument to address illegal cross-border trafficking and professionalized customs, border guards, and law enforcement services, but also as a contribution to conflict settlement, so that elements of competition and contracts with Russia's interests and actions gradually emerged. Furthermore, while Kyiv counterparts expected the deployment of a CSDP mission with more powers, EU countries did not agree on the size and the scope of the mission. UK, Poland, and Sweden favored a broad transformative international presence, while other countries like Italy, Malta, and Hungary pushed for a limited and carefully circumscribed mission. The division of labor between the two missions followed geographical criteria and non-functional criteria, leaving EUBAM to the Moldova-Ukraine state border and assigning to EUM mixed functions with countrywide coverage. This change did not follow a strategic political change, but they followed the turnover from the EU delegation to Ukraine to the EU delegation to Moldova in the management of the project phases. It acknowledged the decreasing of involvement of the European External Service in EUBAM and the increasing participation of the DG NEAR. In the case of Libya, stabilization ended to be equaled with governance of migration flows that was perceived as a threat to member states' national security and EU internal security. Here, the border management policies led to the full scale of securitization of migration governance. The interim strategic review of the EU border assistance mission, another CSDP mission, established in 2013, while it not identified actors in charge of border management intervention in Libya, it emphasized a correlation between SSR assistance, stabilization, and support for Libyan actors to develop a broader border management framework. It focused greater attention to the southern borders, most notably reframing the mission mandate into a regional template, but actually the Libyan counterpart of EUBAM lacked any authority beside Tripoli, and the mission itself was relocated to Tunis, so that the real impact on the ground was very, very limited. And the second part, actually, of the paper, we focus on the shortcomings and how these are perceived by local respondents. A general key finding is that both in Libya and Ukraine, the level of awareness of local respondents vis-à-vis the EU crisis response in security sector reform is particularly lower than in other sectors of the EU engagement. One of the reasons behind this gap, in our opinion, is that the EU missions are absent from the borders, are physically far from the borders. And so their impact is really limited. The EU mission on border management appears to be incoherent and disengaged from local context. And in both cases, the lack of the presence hinders reliability and knowledge, and let alone positive perception. Interesting enough, in both the cases, the implementation of border management and security sector support generates some relevant and intended consequence in terms of empowering actors and bad practice instead of governance and stabilization of border practices. In the case of EU in Ukraine, the EU agenda risks to unintendedly reproduce the level of corruption in the perception of our respondents that its support to security sector is doing. Instead of securing civil society oversight on the activities of the security sector activities, the EU supports to public council, and specifically the ones operating within the Ministry of Internal Affairs, is perceived to replicate informal networks of loyalties that might hinder the reforms towards security institution transparency and accountability. In the case of Libya, too much importance to migration management and collaboration with detention centers results in empowering those departments within the Ministry of Interior that deal with migrants and collaborate with international organizations that enter the detention centers without changing the governance of the sector. Moreover, this results in proliferation of political control from Libyan authorities over foreign organizations through pressure and blackmailing on Libyan local staff, which is often young, and it is forced to act, these local staff, to act as a detective and reporting to Libyan authorities names and activities of the international organizations. Lastly, the phraseology of the EU in managing borders is usually translated as a local definition of security needs that does not take into account any reform for asylum or refugees law. In conclusion, very quickly, we support the idea that the adoption of new policy templates reflects a deeper paradigm shift from transformation to stabilization, but the missions and their presence in both countries appear to reflect more the crisis of the European liberal project rather than solution to actual problems. That's all.
Thank you, Chiara, and also thank you for keeping in time. In response to your paper, I really appreciated the connection you made between border management and broader SSR processes, which I didn't find present in that strong a sense as you did in your paper in other papers. So I really appreciated it. You made a point about analysis of narrative practices of two quite conflicting practices of borderless Europe and fortress Europe. So I was curious to hear from you which of the two you found more reflected in the two case studies. You also made the point if bottom-up approach is to be adopted in the analysis, one should have a look at how local stakeholders and recipients of EU missions define and redefine borders and border management. So how should one look at that, and did you have any success in looking at local responses of border management and narrative about borders which might not necessarily be in tune with the EU's narrative in the two conflict settings? You made a strong point about main constraining factors that imperiled the successfulness of EU missions on the ground, and how its crisis responsiveness created many unintended consequences within security sector. But there must be some benefits of the missions. There might be some strong points and some achievements that you would maybe want to put an emphasis on in your discussion. I found your paper be tuned in a rather critical approach towards the EU and its failing normative approach and failing state-building liberal project, which is now tuned more in terms of securitized approach in terms of stability and security. So maybe you would want to add up some more optimistic tones, if there are any to be found from your case studies or otherwise. So that would be all from me in regards to your presentation. Now we should move to Mr. Ferhatović and listen to presentation on SSR and how is it conducted in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Mali.
Yeah, thank you, Jelena. My name is Enver Ferhatović. I'm research fellow at the ATASP at the Free University Berlin. I'm a member of a 5 members team conducting or having conducted for the past 2.5 years research on EU crisis management in the extended neighborhood. Our case studies are the case studies of Afghanistan, Iraq, and Mali. Specifically, at this point in this paper, we've looked at the lessons learned from the engagements, and since all 3 missions in a wider sense have been dealing with security sector reform, we've also touched upon the methodology. I mean, the SSR has been something the European Union has been doing now for almost 2 full decades. On the macro level, there has been somewhat of an agreement on a joint EU SSR approach, so we've reflected on that. So basically, the structure of our paper is to provide a general context, briefly touch upon the research that has been done so far, to build upon at this stage, so for the past 2.5 years on these 3 case studies, and then apply the, as most of you are probably familiar with it, the FPA methodology of looking at the output effectiveness, policy outcome implementation, and then outcome and impact effectiveness, and draw lessons learned, and specifically looking at goal achievements and the local perception and reception of the crisis management intervention. Intervention is the word or the term used by the European Union. Obviously, I will not use the perspective of the European Union, but it's inevitable to kind of to basically agree on what we're talking about. So the guiding research question or questions are clearly how effective, or that is what was guiding us, the question on the effectiveness of EU crisis response, in particular in the field of CSDP SSR, in the extended neighborhood, talking about geopolitics, touching upon what was discussed in the previous panel, and looking specifically at the constraining enabling factors regarding EU policy formulation, implementation, and impact on the ground. In the final stage, then looking at what are the lessons to be learned from these 3 engagements, and in particular comparing them to the EU lessons learned processes, which have also been going on since 2005, very much institutionally. So I will not go too much into the SSR terminology or EU concept of it, but just to have a base, basically SSR, as defined by the OECD as a process, the transformation of the security system, which includes all the actors, roles, responsibilities, actions, so that it's managed and operated in a manner that it's conducive to development, basically. And EU SSR, since the very early stages, in Macedonia, the Bosnian EUPM experience, very much after cessation of hostilities, there's usually a design program done on the Brussels macro level. It's based on the liberal model. It's very much based on the European norms and respective of state institutions or institution building, especially in the civil justice and security sector. This is very much what is across the 3 cases, with the Iraq case obviously having a rather specific focus on the justice linkages, but again, it had a strong police component as well. So just briefly on some of the key lessons learned from the 2016 most recent exercise done on the External Action Service European Commission level. Institutional capacity is something that the European Union mentions as still a big problem in terms of developing concepts. The policy framework is still very much fragmented. The local perception from the self-assessment is that it's welcome, so the European Union sees itself as an added value locally by all 3, not only these 3 cases, but in general. There is, in its self-assessment, mentioned insufficient flexibility of the programming, There's lack of long-term orientation. As we know, the member states very, very often ad hoc decide to set up these missions. The narrow focus of some of these missions, again, can be interpreted both ways. Is seen as a weakness. Strategic, long-term political approach is not really following the kind of technical approach to security sector reform, which can be also as a result of our project identified as a major weakness, that there's that the political frame is very, very often missing, and SSR being an extremely political process, basically. This linkage is obviously is missing in this context. In the self-assessment, lack of local sensitivity, conflict sensitivity, and local ownership is something that has been mentioned as well, and that the interventions are not really tailored to the context. So moving on to our three cases, basically I will outline very, very briefly what our key findings from the three cases were. Just to talk very briefly about what the mission or the mission mandates outlined for each of them. The Afghanistan mission for EUPOL Afghanistan had a civilian policing mandate in the context of an ever expanding and stronger getting insurgency. It was criticized by experts and also other partners who've been dealing with security sector reform as mistimed. Obviously, a civilian policing focus would have been much more realistic and effective if it came after time of conflict and while fighting an insurgency. It was not appreciated, in particular from the American and NATO partners. In the Iraq context, obviously, I mean, again, the problem with not being able to conduct most of the trainings inside the country and then having to take out whoever the trainees outside of the country to run the trainings for judicial and police forces. And then Mali, I mean, that there in particular, Morten, I think, will talk a bit more about the Mali case. The very strong focus on building up a military force and kind of in the SSR with all the limitations, in particular when it comes to a peace agreement, which does not cover all of the parts of the population, so it's not an inclusive, comprehensive peace agreement. And on the other side, with all the security-averse elements of EU engagement, that basically you cannot follow on what the training or the effects of training are, that there are certain limitations on the provision of equipment, and so on. I will cut this short because we could go on with this quite extensively. Basically, moving on to the lessons learned and what our overall findings, just briefly touching upon the local perception. So we've last year and this year conducted a number of local perception studies to see how the local populations actually perceived our missions. And so in terms of awareness of our policies, in terms of characterizing our assistance, whether they saw the EU SSR as having any impact, and whether the country was better off after the EU intervention. So in the case of Afghanistan, surprisingly, I mean, the security sector reform, which was actually our flagship, was the least recognized. All of the other areas of support by the European Union had higher recognizability. In Iraq, it was absolutely, since it was a very, very minor operation, it was not recognized. 18% of the respondents actually knew about it. In Mali, it was actually much higher. It was around almost 70%. For the impact, most respondents still thought that when now it comes to the concrete question of conflict sensitivity, the European Union's conflict sensitivity was assessed as high, basically 63%. In Iraq, even higher, 83%, and in Mali, 72%. But then later on when I summarize in terms of lessons learned, our conclusions do not really necessarily point to that. Yeah, thanks. When it comes to the aftermath of EU intervention, most respondents in the Afghanistan case thought that the country was better off, 80%. In Iraq, 63%, and in the case of Mali, 56%. Just to give you basically a feel for how those interventions have been perceived. So, moving on to the lessons learned specifically from our findings, and I'll focus on some of the key ones. So basically, EU engagement in practice is too risk-averse. EU missions are too remote, abstract, and not locally embedded. There is no direct correspondence of missions or interventions to the self-defined conflict cycle, which has already been kind of taken out of the whole discourse, official EU discourse. So there was absolutely no correlation from our perspective. We thought that defining and implementing a combination of bottom-up and top-down strategies would actually help balance functional and political requirements much better. Normative principles of crisis response policy do match EU identity, but still internal and institutional ownership of principle is often missing. So basically we're talking about the internal dynamics within the missions and representations in the field. The overlap of EU instruments and actions led to frequent misinterpretations in the field of the roles. So this also led to competition between institutions, particularly the delegation or the commission side, and then the CSDP, SSR side of the missions. Maybe just a couple of more points, and I'll finish. When it comes to the comprehensive approach, I wanted to make 2 points. The comprehensive approach obviously, idealistically, would have helped the European Union make the instruments perform better in the field and become more efficient. But ultimately, our experience from the 3 cases has shown the research that if there is no priority and there is no clarity of direction in this concert of instruments, which are many in the crisis management context, even the SSR, it's never just the CSDP mission present. It's very difficult to identify who's going to provide the political messaging and then provide also the prioritization in the field. I'll leave it at that because I know you will help me with some critical questions and then we can go into more details.
Yeah,
thanks.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I enjoyed reading your paper, and actually paper made in collaboration with the team you belong to. I like the point you raised about the SSR as conceptual framework within which crisis management is being done, that it's not merely application of sustainable development premises to security field, that the EU Commission takes it as suitable to respond to broader set of issues of human rights, good governance, public administration. But while reading through your paper and you went on to research how effective these missions are within that framework, you never made at least I haven't seen you made the point, is it a satisfactory framework still? Or are we in pursuit of new framework in both academic and policy terms, especially in terms of new security challenges? There is a point made in the paper that new security challenges might pose a challenge both for SSR and how the EU's missions are being conducted in the future. So maybe you would want to take that point further. I will, I thought you might expect, but I'm not challenging the choice of the case studies. You framed it in your paper that they are made in similar cases design, so they are all post-conflict settings with weak state authority, high corruption, weak public administration capacities, and lack of democratic accountability throughout security sectors. So I was wondering, could you think of different case study, would you, this is really hypothetical, like, would you expect your results to be applicable to a bit different case studies, if you can think of any, which might not share these same features? Maybe this is not even the fair question that I'm now posing. I'm not even sure it is. And finally, since during the panel 1 there was a bit of discussion about data gathering techniques and how smart we are in designing them and applying them, since you listed a number of enabling and constraining factors, and in your research you looked at a number of variables, so I thought something must have posed a serious challenge in that respect. Was something exceptionally hard to get data on? Was it like local perceptions or not, or something completely else? So I thought you might want to maybe bring it down further on that. So that was my feedback on Afghanistan, Iraq, and Mali. And now we are moving to Mr. Bøås and the case study of the EU crisis responsiveness in Mali.
Thank you. This is a paper that I've written together with our colleague Bård Drange at NUPI, but also with substantial contributions from Abdul Wahab Sissé of ARGA, which is the Alliance for Governance in Africa, our Mali Sahel partner. And I would like to stress that one of the reasons why I think we have been relatively successful in this program across the various cases is very much due to the fact that the wideness of the partnership, that we have had not, I mean, our partners in Mali, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and so on, has been equal research partners with us. They have not simply been data gatherers, and we have written and co-written a lot of these together, which of course enable us some local insight that otherwise would not have been possible, because we would simply not have the time or resources, people like me, to stay for 6-7 months in Mali. That wouldn't have been possible within the budget framework of this project, and not in the larger framework of my time management either. So that has, and this I think makes the EU UNPAC quite unique. I mean, I've heard from Commission sources that they have never seen a project of this type with so many non-European partner institutes, because we have had partners on the ground in all of the countries where we have been working. This paper is an attempt to problematize and criticize, but also to come up with suggestions for one particular part of what the EU is involved with in the Sahel. And that is the EUTM, the European Union Training Mission to Mali. And we're also touching briefly in the paper about various aspects of the EU Civilian Capacities program in the Sahel. And you may think that that my criticism is very strong, and in a certain way it is, but I mean, it's a critique given in the hope that we will be able to contribute to some much needed rethinking concerning current approaches. So I'm not saying that it's bad that we are trying to do this. We just need to do it much better than we have been doing. And the reason for this is also that what we're seeing in the Sahel, it confronts the EU, but also other external stakeholders with a larger problem on how to deal with fragile states. And it's the proximity of a number of fragile states together with obvious organized crime in this area, obvious armed jihadists, and mass movement of people that has pushed the whole issue of the Sahel to the very top of the security agenda in Brussels. In many ways, I mean, the lack of political stability here, the lack of real peace and reconciliation, the lack of development, is in many ways also threatening regime stability in Europe. And governments in Paris, in Berlin, and so on, they know about this. They saw what happened in 2014-15. Europe is not fit for a future where it has to deal with about 1 million refugees coming. Simply not fit for that kind of future. There was never, and one talked about a European refugee crisis. I mean, there was never European refugee crisis. But Europe had the refugee crisis is real, but it's elsewhere, everywhere else than Europe, basically. There's 60 million plus out there somewhere. They are not in Europe, and they obviously cannot come to Europe, all of these either. But Europe had a problem dealing with something that it obviously could have dealt with much better. Europe is still not convinced that it will be able to deal with this, so therefore it's trying to get other people to deal with it. This is basically what is happening. EUTM, EU CivCap Sahel, is basically an attempt to build a new European border, but this time not in the Mediterranean, but deep in the Sahel. The way that we, for example, have now more or less been able to strangle Agadez in Niger as a migrant hub. This is happening. And EUTM is part of this. I mean, there are good reasons for trying to reorganize the Malian army. It's obvious that it needs reorganization. That is not anything that we question. I mean, if you look at it, but if you look at the security situation and what is happening on the ground there, what you see is that it's not moving in the right direction. It is getting worse. From 2013 and onwards, the conflict in Mali has spread. It's more violent today than it was before this huge international intervention started. The UN is there with MINUSMA, a large UN peacekeeping stability operation. You have Operation Barkhane, the French one, which followed after Operation Serval. And you have these large-scale, very costly EU interventions in the form of EUTM and EU CivCap Sahel. And why is this not working? Is the question that we are trying to get some hold of here. And I mean, as Enver rightly pointed out, I mean, Malians are quite happy with the EU. At least those that know anything about it, they're quite happy with it. Yeah, and we have also interviewed soldiers. I mean, the training that EUM offers is very popular. We have met people who have been to 3, 4, 5 courses. They're supposed to have one, but they've been to 3, 4, 5 courses. Why do they like it so much? Well, it takes them away from the battlefront. That's one obvious reason why they like it so much. Another reason is that this is seen as a way of getting promotion. But I mean, my point here is that the officers of EUTM, the European officers, they are highly trained. They are, at least most of them, quite motivated, at least in the beginning, not so much after they have been there for a while. But they know very well that they are executing a mandate that they really cannot execute. Because the only thing that we know about the effectiveness of EUTM is basically by looking at the conflict situation, and it's getting worse. Because there is absolutely no monitoring and evaluation of this whole thing. And it's like a gigantic experiment trying to reform and retrain an army that for all practical purposes is fully operational. It is at war. The Malian army is at war. This is what we are trying to do. And how we can do that without any monitoring and evaluation, real monitoring and evaluation, because the only way to monitor an army and evaluate it is to follow it into combat. But the EUTM officers are not allowed to do this. So basically what the EU is doing here is spending an awful lot of money, and the only way to sort of look at it is sort of basically do like this. We don't know why this is not working. And this is, for me, a serious problem, and we need to sort of find a way of getting around this. One obvious way would have been to redo the mandate of EUTM, allowing officers at least to be able to do some supervision in the field. The problem is that there is no 5 minutes, or I don't need that much more. The problem right now is that they simply don't know. They are locked up in a hotel, a previous hotel in Bamako and in Koulikoro. They are not able to follow them out in the field. And therefore, I mean, the training is probably very good, but it doesn't seem to matter very much. So there is a much deeper problem with the Malian army that has never been acknowledged in the EUTM mandate, and that is you can train people to become better at fighting. You can give people human rights training, which obviously is not working because, I mean, almost every month, I mean, the Malian army is singled out by Amnesty International and others as for human rights abuses in its anti-terror campaigns in central Mali. So there is a much deeper problem here of how to get a republican spirit into this army. And the first way of start dealing with this is to look at how are people recruited into the army. How are people, in fact, recruited into the army? Well, I mean, it's a huge competition in order to get into the Malian army because you're paid. So, I mean, starting with this and seeing how we could try to do something with this would have been the obvious place to start. Because if you don't have, what you have in the Malian army is not a republican spirit, but you have a corruption spirit. That is one of the main problems. Where people, in fact, are competing to get into this army by also, one way to get enlisted is basically that you give away 2-3 months of salary to higher officers. And when it starts with this kind of rot, it just continues. So this is what you need to deal with. If the EU is so desperate in improving border management in Mali, we were sitting in Mali. I think, Eva, you were there as well when we had that meeting with the EU Civ Cap, and I asked them if they had given any idea to how improved border management would translate to local Malian communities who live on the border, who depends on crossing these borders, if not every day, very often, both for seasonal migration of herds, but also for trade and a lot of other purposes. Well, I mean, if you just go to them and talk, now we're going to strengthen border management, they would resist it. They would see this as a threat to their livelihoods. I'm not saying that it's not a bad idea to having more respect for borders in this part of the world, but you need to find a way of doing it so that you keep people with you. What we are doing now is that we are working against people. We need to build more genuine partnerships with local communities. Otherwise, the current dam building, because we are building dams in Mali and Sahel right now against refugees and migrants, it's not going to work. We need to deal with the supply situation here, not only building a dam, because everybody knows that if you build a dam and you constantly have water pouring into it, well, I mean, sooner or later, water will either run on top of the dam or it will go somewhere else. And this is what is happening. We need to find ways of working with people and not against them. And what this paper therefore suggests is an attempt to start that conversation about how we can redirect both the EU operations, but also these other operations that is currently now going on in the Sahel, where it finds because what it needs to find is a much better balance between security and development. Right now, we are almost exclusively really focusing on the security side, and security for us, that is eliminating jihadists, arresting what we see as sort of those behind the trafficking of people, and preventing mass migration. I mean, obviously, I'm not arguing here for opening the doors and let everybody who wants to come to Europe. I mean, I'm not stupid. I realize that this is not the answer. The answer to the problems in Agadez is not to keep Agadez as a migration hub. But if you want to prevent migration, you need to look at why people so desperately want to leave these areas. And we are not doing that right now. Thank you.
Thank you. The picture you presented, I would say, somewhere in between human security and state security, and the clash between the two. Because some of the efforts the EU is investing in Mali, according to your account, is in restoring state authority. But then you question, like, is the state authority to be restored, one which is functioning and legitimate one? So I seem to pose to you the same question that was addressed to Professor McGuinty this morning, like which local actors then we should communicate to and whose human security is to be tackled if the mission or any future mission is to be successful. Because as you said, some of the local population is actually benefiting of poor reform, of badly managed borders. They are profiting from corruption and from illicit trade around borders, etc. And stopping refugee flows seems to be directly endangering human security of some people. So who are the local actors and how to get a grasp of human security of larger population. I also appreciated very much the strong points you made about poorly designed trainings being delivered to the forces that are actually combat forces, that are actually engaged in conflict while the training is actually going on. So what to do with that, and especially the point you made about the inclusion within the security sector, that one has to look at the legitimacy of security sector which are not excluding some parts of society alongside ethnic or other lines. So that's the point I just wanted to raise, that I appreciate it, and I thought it's quite prominent in your paper. So that goes for my address to you. Thank you very much. And now we are moving to the case study of Ukraine and EU crisis response there. And to you, Professor Samokhvalov.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting to Brussels Forum. Thank you very much to Professor McGuinty for his, well, apparently he's not here, enjoying sunny Belgrade rather than being stuck with us in the room. But I will refer to his lecture with gratitude because he gave us very interesting structuring departure point about the need to bring the local back. And basically my paper has its main argument that was and is, well, its main argument is that the European Union was, well, fell short from taking into account local dynamics in Ukraine and bringing in the social dimension in its efforts to transform the country. And the paper is split into three parts. In the first part, I discuss the sort of what you unpack made very clear in structuring the pre-crisis phase, which is very important, and I'll speak briefly about the period 2010-13. Then I will speak about the crisis, the violent phase of the conflict, 2014 a bit, and the role of the EU in that stage. And then I'll take one of the case studies of when EU tried really hard to transform one specific sector in Ukraine, especially public administration reform. So, and everywhere I will try to show how the EU managed to succeed and why it failed by not bringing social and local insight into the conversation. So if we go back to 2010, what was missing in the EU approach to Ukraine was basically the lack of societal insight. The entire conversation and the entire relationship with the Ukraine at that point was shaped by the long, prolonged conversation and negotiations of the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement, major part of which was deep comprehensive free trade area. Most of the officers working on Ukraine would be assigned to DG Trade. They would be great specialists in trade, but what they were missing, that from 2010 to 2013, even though President Yanukovych, allegedly pro-Russian president, made a huge effort to introduce and transfer all necessary standards to the Ukrainian legislation, there was clear growing resentment within the society with his neoliberal policies, exuberant spending, selective application of law. So in 2013, early in the year, we had like the most popular graffiti across Kyiv was the dead Yanukovych, the Yanukovych which was assassinated. And the number of symptoms of the revolution were so clear that one must have been blind not to see them. Unfortunately, at that point, political officers in the European External Action Service who were dealing with Ukraine were only 1.5 officers, desk officers dealing with Ukraine. The rest were assigned to the division, EU-Russia division, 25 people working there. So clearly, that's something that the EU could fail to see. Secondly, even though the technocratic agenda, the EU tried to present it as a purely technocratic exercise, the comprehensive free trade agreement with Ukraine, it was not the case for Russia. For Russia, it was very strong, symbolic, and geopolitically an identitarian project, so to try to bring Ukraine to the customs union. That was missed by people in the DG Trade. They just said, no, we can't have trilateral negotiations to have this sort of compatibility of the two integration projects. So we and Ukraine decided to join, to have association with Ukraine. So colleagues from Moscow, comrades, you can basically, go back. And third point, what EU was missing, that actually at that, and which is often missing in the analysis of Ukraine, is that at that point, unfortunately for Ukraine, President Yanukovych has successfully given away major part of Ukraine's sovereignty. You know, if you think about the defense minister of Ukraine, 2 of them during Yanukovych time were Russian citizens with background in Russian services. Security sector, security service of Ukraine was also controlled by the Russian. And that basically what was happening in Moscow, there was understanding that Ukraine, if not ready, but soon will be ready to rejoice in reunification with Russia. That was a very strong perception. I had several interviews in Moscow. And basically, when 3 these related but not identical processes came into one point, Yanukovych decided not to sign association agreement, ordered to beat several dozen students in Kyiv Central Square. That provoked a revolution. We often make huge difference between Euromaidan revolution of nice, non-violent students and violent Euro revolution of dignity, which included huge coalition, sometimes even non-European forces. So it was not only about EU, it was more about dignity and about protest against Yanukovych. Unfortunately, Moscow saw it as a sort of geopolitical and creeping geoeconomic expansion of Europe into its near abroad, so to say. And here I'm going to the second part of my paper. Here, that the Operation Polite People, annexation of Crimea, had taken place, and then the Operation Russian Spring, which is effectively hybrid warfare in the east of Ukraine, followed. All these things were missed by the European Union because they couldn't see the developments on the ground on Ukraine. Huge tectonic shift in Russia's perception of Europe, of Europe and of Ukraine. So one must give credit to Europe, however, that when all these dramatic events took place, the response was very swift and well, when it came to big decisions, they were made quite quickly. European Union, first of all, introduced several rounds of sanctions, which had very strong symbolic meaning for Russia. Many people, again, in my interviews in Moscow, many people believe that the sanctions had not significant economic effect, even though they had, but more symbolic sort of alienation from Europe for Russia. That led to de-escalation of the hybrid warfare in the East. Second important point was, of course, the Europe's sort of commitment to multilateralism and participation in the and push for Minsk agreement and Normandy conversation, which also prevented further collapse of Ukraine and, of course, generous financial assistance. Some people in the Commission were saying what we were doing with finances at that point would be unimaginable 2 or 3 years ago. Vining funding from one budget line to another budget line, spending money which we were not supposed to spend that year, but we were spending them, only to give Ukraine some time to regain, to rebuild state capacity and regain its standing, not to fall apart. That was successful. 2014, 2015, I believe, is the year when European Union demonstrated its best qualities, and I don't know where they've taken them from, but that was probably the year of European heroes. But what followed afterwards, unfortunately, from about late 2015, we can say that European Union went back into its traditional business, traditional technocratic approach. And one of my case studies is actually public administration reform in Ukraine. What happened, the reform was negotiated and pushed by the European Union in 2015, and it was very political. So we could see that the negotiation, drafting of the legislation of public administration reform was a permanent process of interaction between various dimensions. Anybody who has done any theories of transgovernmental cooperation would say there's nothing transgovernmental here. People from EU support, Ukraine support group, which is like interagency site in Brussels, were talking to civil society sector in Ukraine. Civil society sector would go to media. Media would start public campaign, and that would create bottom-up pressure, which pushed Ukrainian elites to adopt this very unpopular, very inconvenient for the Ukrainian elites, political elites, law. So we can say that at this point we had several coalitions which were cutting across various dimensions. So leaks of information from External Action Service to members of the European Parliament, then to German Parliament, then from Bundestag to Ukrainian civil society. The flows of information were amazing. So I had a chance to do some participant observations, and really this is why in the early session I was talking about this. Unfortunately, and I'm wrapping up here, once the legislation was adopted and it went from big, highly politicized societal issue and went into implementation phase, all hells were broken. And what I mean by that, the actual political elite managed to reintroduce all the possible strings attaching to public servants, because in ideal world we are trying to create a Weberian state, independent bureaucracy. But when it came from legislation which is normally adopted by the parliament, but when it went down to secondary legislation, ministerial decrees and all the rest, at that point you could basically see day by day how they introduced new elements of control, whereby politicians can actually control the pay of the public servant, how they can control the recruitment, which has become very subjective and non-transparent, and how they managed sometimes to intimidate the members of the selection committees for the recruitment into civil servant. So today, 3 years down the line, the conclusions of the papers are basically the European Union failed to understand the importance of existing societal codes in Ukraine. They see nice coalition, which is called Coalition for the European Future, but they fail to see that these are the same people who were working with President Yanukovych, who are still sticking to informal networks and power politics, and they rather play with the rules and not by the rules. When the discussions and implementation goes to technocratic level, or not to the expert level, this is where normally all the bending of rules is taking place. And unfortunately, something that Europe has missed in 2014-15, there was extremely successful use of public diplomacy. The head of the European delegation would come up with press releases criticizing ministers. That's diplomatically, of course, was a huge blunder, but that led to adoption of many laws. A new head of delegation is much more skillful and heavyweight Brussels bureaucrat, but he doesn't do public politics. And this is public policy, right? And this is quite sad. So, from my conclusion, from missing the pre-crisis stage in 2010-2013, Europe managed to get things right in 2014-2015, but when it went back to expert level and entered into this technocratic spirit, we're unfortunately going back to pre-crisis stage because the legitimacy of the current Ukrainian government and the state institutions are plummeting, and that might be sort of beginning of a new crisis. I'll stop at this happy note.
Thank you. Thank you. It's not really a happy note. You made it straightforward from the very beginning that most of the EU's failure in pre-crisis period in Ukraine is due to its lack of understanding of complex political dynamics and social dynamics. I dare to say, but that's probably because of the limited time frame you had both for your paper and for your presentation. I wasn't really convinced. I could go happily with that note, but I wasn't really convinced how do you prove that the EU did not understand the political and social dynamics, because the response wasn't timely, and what was supposed to be done in different manner, because then you go on saying once they understood how the complex situation is and once they understood complexity of external actors' involvement, mainly Russia, then they anticipated all possible resources and they triggered some things correctly. So I was wondering, like, how do you prove they failed to understand it from the onset, and what were the repercussions of that? You made then some interesting points on veto players in reform processes. So maybe you would like to comment further on that. Who are the main veto players in crisis as on post-conflict as it unfolds now, and where the ownership rests? It's obviously with the political elite, as I understood your point mainly, but you also wanted to bring a broader set of actors on the agenda, for example, religious leaders. So maybe you would like to comment further on that. So both on veto players and who are the most important in broader set of actors in political and social dynamics. So that's what I wanted to know. So enough for me, and maybe to give a floor for our participants just for a few minutes each if they want to address any of my points before turning to you. Should we start from you? Yeah, sure. Chiara.
Okay, thank you for your question. And I would start, I think, from the last one. Yeah, we are quite critical in our paper, in our analysis, But as mentioned, Morten, actually, yes, we are very critical, but we are also expecting to give policy recommendation. We gave policy recommendation, and we are here to say, okay, let's improve the action. And I just remember that I am mostly on the Libyan case, so maybe I will talk mostly about Libyan problems and case and so on. And well, I'm quite pessimistic on the EU action in Libya so far, at least I would say so far. And especially, I flag out that our research has been conducted in 2017. So mostly data are referred to that period and in the beginning of this year as far as it concerns me. The EU mission now is a part of the Libyan conflict, as it is, because it supports a Libyan government which is not it's the Western-backed government, and it is not the government of all Libya, for all the political story of the war in Libya now. So it's a long story, but the action so far is in the frame of a conflict, and EU is not, I think, is not dealing with the conflict in a peaceful way, I would say. The unintended consequence that I mentioned is that because if you are backing the government that has many opponents in the south, in the southern area where you are supposed to go, it is clear that it's not the real, the good way to do things. And I know that everyone is aware of this. We are not discovering something, but so far nothing has changed. So, okay, something must be done. We have been talking with Libyans. In the case of Libya, we have been talking about with Libyans, with EU officers in Tunis, and also in Brussels. And we see that there is a chain of command from Brussels to Tunis to Libya, which is very complicated. So we know that good intentions are there, but there are also very complicated ways to translate this policy. And we know that even EU officers struggle to implement these policies. They struggle to understand who is the Libyan to talk with. I know that the situation is very complicated, but so far it is not a good way. In the case of Ukraine, discussing with the co-author, and I would like also to mention that the research has been conducted not only by Italians, I would say, but also by a Ukrainian counterpart in the University of Kiev, and which is called the Jean Monnet Center of Excellence in European Studies, which is part of the National University of Kiev. And they registered a very good perception of the EUBAM mission, at least until the introduction of EUM. So it means that there was some kind of good travel. For instance, the EUBAM mission was doing a very good job with local counterparts in communicating, in doing follow-up, in doing evaluation. So this was disrupted by the following mission established after the political framework crisis approach in 2014. And actually for other positive outcomes in case of Libya, and I feel also in the case of Ukraine, the humanitarian action of the EU is quite good. It's quite good, it's considered well by the respondents. So it means that something is actually doing going in the good direction. But when it comes to security sector reform and border management, because this is the frame of the interim strategic reviews, of the strategic approach to these countries, they put together these two the specific areas for this stabilization expectation that I mentioned, especially from member states. We see that actually the EU is like sitting back, and it gave up in having a clear position. They prefer to have short-term solution, a lot of capacity building programs, a lot of, I think also in the case of Ukraine, but I'm not sure, but in case of Libya, I think that almost everything is about capacity building in the case, in the frame of security sector support. I'm not talking about the other programs. We have been talking with everyone, especially in the case of Ukraine, they also worked with the border guards, so they collected very good sample. In the case of Libya, yeah, we use peer and fixer, and we managed to have all the data. Narration of borders, Fortress Europe. Well, I think it's a consequence of what we saw on the field so far. I'm quite open to review my position, but so far it's clear that the EU is struggling in the case of Libya to stop migrant flows, to stop human smuggling and save lives at sea. But the issue is that how to improve the management of migration, which is stopping these people from crossing, and at any cost, without talking about asylum or refugees law, and as Libya is not a member of the 1951 Geneva Convention. They're quite sensible on that, the Libyan authorities, we understand that, but the EU is not pushing forward this. Okay, just...
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, you addressed most of it. Thank you very much. Enver, would you take it?
Take up the question on the effectiveness first. Obviously, I mean, comparing to other actors in the SSR field, the European Union, I would say, with 2 decades of experience in that field, is not more or less effective. But obviously, there are prime examples that we should flag out where it does add value. And from those examples, I mean, obviously, there are like two lessons to be drawn from that experience. First of all, it's an evolving model, and the fact that the European Union has been discussing this, I mean, the European Commission and also within the Council, this has been discussed also now lately with the External Action Service. The model or the agreement on how to do it, there is no one size that fits basically all these scenarios. And if you talk about the extended neighborhood, and in spite of us trying to construct a comparable dimension to this, all these 3 case studies or cases basically are immersed in regional settings which are very, very different. So, I mean, obviously it depends on the premises you make, and then you can compare them to a certain degree. But then again, for instance, if you then go into the specific cases, Afghanistan, there certainly have been success stories. It depends again on how you frame success. The institution building model that we've applied, which we also mentioned in the paper, is something that can be certainly modeled or made as into a prime example model which can be used for other crisis areas. The female policing success, which has been locally owned and built upon with the very ambitious goal of building it up to 10,000, I think that's another achievement. So in the meantime, it has become an Afghan-owned project. The same goes for the training facilities, which basically in the beginning stages have been very much EU-dominated, but now in the meantime, they are very much financed and dominated by the Afghans themselves. The Iraqi example and the Malayan example, I think there are less. There are less lessons or concepts to be really drawn from. Going back to your question on the challenges posed to data gathering, it's extremely difficult. We're talking about open conflicts. We're talking about researchers going out there and risking their lives. I mean, I've given you an example of people even dying trying to do research. So it is extremely difficult. And then even the question is what kind of data and what kind of information can you really come back with? Because the stats that are available, the information that's out in the public sphere, how reliable is it, how politically motivated is it, and so on. So that is a huge challenge. But then on the other side of that medal is also that the European Union constantly talks about benchmarking and becoming much more managerial in terms of assessing its own work in the field. So mandate papers cannot really read, and that's what lots of experts and opinions on the mandates and the missions reflect, is that you can't just go in there with a shopping list, which ultimately, if it's not seriously being measured by any benchmarks, I mean, what is it worth? Ultimately, you will again politically assess your, and then I didn't come to the point where I would just give you examples of the EU reflecting on its own work, and it always sounds very, very positive, under the bottom line. It sounds like, you know, we've done a great job, we've trained 10,000 people, we've spent this and this amount of money, we've sent hundreds or thousands of staff into the field. So ultimately, it depends on how you frame it and how you, the wording, and the European Union is very, very skilled in putting the right spin on particular these very challenging missions. So the question on the applicability of, in a way I responded to that, yes, we ultimately have to draw lessons from these three extended neighborhood engagements and try to see if in the second generation SSR model, which is now being framed up, there is room to basically become multidimensional, less Eurocentristic. The prioritization and involvement of the locals to be there prior to the basically putting a mission out of nowhere or intervention into a conflict scenario. And then obviously what I mentioned before, it's really important to put the list of priorities in terms of, you know, you can't do everything. I mean, these SSR missions can't be there to address all the deficiencies of a security sector. There has to be a list of priorities, and we have to play to our strengths. And our strengths are really our expertise in institution building, and that's and training. Those are two areas where we definitely have an added value. That's at least from our three cases.
Thank you very much. Yeah, Morten, on who is human security?
I'll try to be brief. I think that you asked the question, I mean, who's security? I mean, I think the first thing we need to acknowledge is, and which is not very much acknowledged these days, is that what we are faced with in a place like Mali, but also Afghanistan and Iraq in many ways, is what I call the fragility dilemma. And the fragility dilemma comes in two bits. The first is that these are the countries most in need of external assistance, but it's also the countries where it will be most difficult to get external assistance to work. Why is that the case? The reason why is that, I mean, the traditional donor countries has become quite good at being donors, but they're good at being donors in countries where there is a counterpart, where there is a state that actually works. So basically, I mean, if you want to sort of make an impact in a place like Mali, you need to, that old knowledge about how to act as a donor doesn't really work in a place like Mali, where there is no, the state is there, but it's also not there in many ways. So you need to sort of build a completely new framework, and that work has just started. The second part of the fragility dilemma is basically that one would believe that in a place like Mali, where the government is so weak, that this would be donor paradise. I mean, they desperately need our money, so you would imagine that you could get these people to roll over and do everything. Well, I mean, that is not the case. I mean, it's extremely difficult to find anybody in Bamako who is very impressed with the current regime and the president. And almost on a weekly basis, there is a new European delegation in Mali who goes to IBK, that's the president, and complains about something. And you know, he sits there listening to this rave and rants from various European delegations, and after a while he will just tell them, "Are you finished now? If so, give me the money and you can leave." And then we leave, because we don't see any alternative to this regime, and therefore we are extremely reluctant to put much pressure on them beyond the usual rhetorics about their mismanagement of the economy, of the war, of the human rights situation, and so on. But it doesn't have any effect. It doesn't really matter. On the other hand, I mean, what we need to realize is that the Malian state almost doesn't exist in any positive manner. But still, I mean, the Malians desperately, they want a working state. I mean, even people who live under jihadist rule wants a state that works. I mean, it was very obvious from some interviews we have done where we asked people about who lived under the influence of a group called the Katiba Masina. And they have invented something which I think is quite neat and smart of them. And they have invented these mobile courts of the Katiba Masina. And when we ask people about the mobile courts of the Katiba Masina, the usual reply is, it's just like the state, only that it works. So people have a craving for the state. And we need to, if we are to work with people instead of against them, we need to be able to convince people that the supposedly liberal state project that we are in favor of, that it in fact can deliver something meaningful to them. People need to see that there is a possibility of some sort of liberal state model in Mali that actually can deliver. Because right now, I mean, we are in a state of competition on this with the jihadists, and they are delivering better than we are. That is what we have to face up to. And then we have to start delivering, and that means that we need to turn this around from a relatively fruitless hunt for terrorists in the sand dunes of the Sahel to a project of human security, where we use the forces, including the MINUSMA, not as a second leg to the anti-terror approach of Barkhane, but use these 10,000 plus soldiers to in fact give human protection. That's what we need to tune it to, but then we need to tune down our own risk awareness, because this is the only way forward, but in the short term it would mean that what is already a deadly UN mission would become even deadlier in the short run. But in the long run there is no alternative to it. Otherwise we will continue to keep a country like Mali, like I think we have done with Afghanistan for so many years now. We keep them on artificial international life support system. And there is no sustainable future in that.
Thank you. Vsevolod?
Yes, 3 questions. First, whether it was really, well, you are not convinced that that was really missing. There were several points which proved this. I was working there quite closely with both the EU delegation in Ukraine and doing some interviews. So basically what we can see, even the allocation of resources. The allocation of resources was not about politics. It was about association agreement, and it was about economics. Baroness Ashton, High Representative, never traveled to Ukraine at that point and didn't display any interest. It was outsourced to one of the DGs, so basically suggesting that it was low on the political agenda. Many European diplomats were basically saying, yes, we are negotiating with this authoritarian leader because he seems to have come for a very long time. So there was no understanding that things were changing. And I don't want to come across as unrecognized genius, but I was working closely with Ukrainian diplomats, and they were saying there's such a huge societal demand for violent protests. Police was beaten in the streets in 2013 and 2012. So there was this demand. It was obvious when I tried to speak to people both in the council and in the relevant institution. This discussion was basically, falling on deaf ears. And I'm not saying that all of them are incompetent, but at that point they missed the point. I have all this, and those political officers which were dealing with Ukraine, they would rather deal with the fact that Tymoshenko was in prison, the former prime minister and leader of the opposition, which is of course an important fact, but it was not about the major, the most crucial, critical challenge coming from Ukraine. Second, veto players. I think this question, who is blocking the reforms, is actually revealing a bigger issue in our conceptualization of state. Right? I can say that it is party of the president Poroshenko. Some people in this party were blocking reforms. Some party in the Popular Front, some people in the party of the former Prime Minister Yatsenyuk were blocking the reforms. But what is interesting, at the same time, within all these parties, you can have people who were pushing for reforms. So I think we are getting back to our understanding of social and political in Ukraine. It is not about political parties. Sometimes the outcomes are shaped by networks which are cross-party, cross-bench, cross-dimensional, etc. So I could name you like network of that specific person or that person which is linked to president, but not the entire president's party. So that gives us interesting insight into how to study these things. And again, getting back to social, I mentioned in the paper traditional leaders, or I would rather say community leaders. And it comes from most interesting incident, which has not been very high on their radar, but in July 2014, some of the Russian infiltrators had taken administrative buildings on the Azov coast, the city of Mariupol. Not as big as Donetsk, but still major industrial center. And what happened, the local school headmaster actually went to these administrative buildings, and she pointed to to several of the local people involved in the capture of the building, and said, you are now supporting Russians who are bringing the war. And basically, with her authority, she managed to undermine that element of hybrid warfare, and basically within 24 hours, Mariupol was taken back by the Ukrainian armed forces. And if you could see that woman who is in her late 60s, basically she challenged Putin in that small coastal town. So, and if we go across Ukraine, we can see a number of cases when, you know, a priest a local priest has higher authority than local mayor and can speak against corruption. So what I'm trying to say is, or relate back to what Professor McGuinty was saying, we should go back from what we in the analysis of Ukraine often call NGOcracy. Of course, civil society is important and NGOs are important, but we need to involve those people who don't have skills to apply for funding, to set up formal center, who spend all their energy every day working on the ground, on grassroots level, without being formally recognized and acknowledged and funded by Europe. These are local community leaders, which I was alluding to.
Thank you for that note. So the floor is open for approximately or a bit less than 10 minutes for your questions. So I guess we would have something on a variety of cases presented here. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, microphone, please. Please just present yourself.
My name is Adam. I'm a student of the 3rd year of the Faculty of Security Studies of University of Belgrade. I have a question for Dr. Now, sorry for the pronunciation, Samokhvalov. Oh, thank you. I think that at one point you mentioned that there was a perception of impending unification between Ukraine and Russia within Russian governmental circles. With that in mind, and with everything that happened, it probably isn't possible anymore. But was it possible at any moment? Was it just perception, or were there any actual probable chances of it happening? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, let's take the second one. Let's take the whole row of 4, and then.
Could you please forward my business card? My name is Gordana Vukomanović, and I have a question. I have 2 questions. It is not important who is prepared to answer. What Serbia and European Union can learn from the Ukrainian lesson, however, it's not important. And do you believe that Serbia has capacity, and if yes, why, to fight terrorism and illegal immigration? That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Third, here.
Hi, Kurt Bassiner, Democratization Policy Council. 2 quick observations and then a question for anybody who wants to field it drawing from them. It seems that a connecting thread here is a standing presumption that EU security equals regime security in the relationship you're talking about, and it's therefore presumed without a lot of depth of interrogation that they're allies in reform or even transformation if there's more appetite there, even though there's a lot of demonstrable falsehood there. So the question is, who are the EU mission's actual audience? Who are the constituency for these missions? Because at least from my perspective, it's not the people in these countries. It's back home to say we're doing something. And to Dr. Samokhvalov, you said something very fascinating and subversive that I think pointed in the direction of moving forward about this workaround to pressure the government from below, which is not standard ops for the EU. That's quite outside the lanes, but it worked until it ran into the blockage. Do you detect any appetite to try to learn from that and say we could do that again in recognition that the governments are actually adversaries rather than allies?
Thank you. The fourth one.
Thank you. Andriy Cvetic, graduate student at the Faculty of Political Science and the Faculty of Philosophy, and teaching assistant at the Faculty of Organizational Science. So I would like to address the problem of Mali. That was the most interesting in a theoretical manner. So I was thinking about the concept of the state. Do you think that insisting on the concept of the state is just prolonging the conflict and the problems that Mali has, considering its negative sovereignty? And what other kind of organizations of political community could more fit to the complex situation in that country?
Thank you. So I will open the floor to you, Vsevolod, the first one. You have a number of issues.
Yeah, I'll try to be as brief as possible. But Ukraine could get reunited with Russia. I mean, Russians strongly believe that, and effectively, if we do some comparative analysis, in 2003, President Kuchma actually signed an agreement with Russia about creating single economic space, and Ukrainians didn't produce significant social unrest about it. What was different, though, with Yanukovych, that he was basically the most incompetent dictator I've ever seen. So, and I worked a lot with Central Asia. I can tell you that even Turkmenistan or other countries, Yanukovych was the worst. So I think that even if Ukraine signed agreement or entered the customs union with Russia and with further perspective to sort of closer integration, there would be still a revolution. It wouldn't be Euromaidan, but it would be still a revolution against Yanukovych. So that would create, of course, that would be a different story, but overall, that's pretty much how I see things were going on at that point. The question about the appetite, I'm afraid not. So that was a specific person, head of delegation, who was well, you know that Ukraine and Poland had very special sort of emotional relationship. That gentleman was from Poland. He was quite outspoken and could go public about president's decision, which was again his own risk, and he has to pay for it now, sitting in a small place and representing EU, but still not very fascinating job. But overall, I think that modus operandi of European diplomats is quite, well, low profile, behind door elite politics. In some cases it works, but I'm afraid that in case of Ukraine, it wouldn't. Yeah, I guess these are two. And third one, what Ukraine could learn from the example, what Serbia could learn from the case. And the European Union. I guess the lessons are being drawn currently. One of them is that, you know, again, I'm probably repeating what Benedict Anderson has already said, and Gellner, that nations, and what Professor McGuinty said today in the morning, right, we are still living in a number of imagined communities, right? So if you fail to address someone else's propaganda who is saying that you are no longer a state and that you are artificial construct and that your nation is about to fall apart, then at some point people will start believing in this. So, you know, many people in Kyiv would crucify me for that, but the war in the East is not only Russian invasion. There are a huge number of Ukrainians who just believed that Russia is bringing to them good, nice 1970s or 1960s, right? And that happened because, you know, because of Russian media, because of the inability of the Ukrainian government to address this issue. EU has started to work on it. I think that EU Stratcomist, the department within External Action Service, has also organized recently something in Belgrade on information warfare. So I think we should pay more, we should take more seriously soft matters, which until recently was, you know, considered preserve of people in university or information studies. But these are really turning into hard problems.
Thank you. Question on Mali, yeah, question on concept of state, and then Enver, yeah.
Thank you. The concept of the state, I mean, the state is this mysterious thing that social scientists have struggled for almost centuries to define, because, I mean, we think we know what it is, but we only know what it is when it's not there, because the state is something that basically, the good state is an invisible state. I mean, the problem, I mean, there are two ways of looking at this. I mean, take my country, Norway, as an example. I mean, it's a welfare state, but the state is almost invisible. I don't need to sort of think about it. It's there, and it sort of provides for me every day. I mean, it makes my life extremely predictable because I know what I will meet every day. The Malian state is extremely weak, but it's also extremely visible. It's something that you have to deal with all the time. It's a constant negotiation of it. And then the issue sort of, can we reimagine this? Well, I mean, there has been a lot of writing about this in the various social sciences, particularly political science, but I mean, it almost always ends up in extremely wishy-washy, naive ways of thinking of something that is borderless and communities that nicely live together. Well, I mean, we are humans. We don't work like that. I mean, in a world of states, there is not a room for anything else than a state. So, I mean, the only way to deal with this is to make these states work again. There is simply no solution to it. I mean, then if there had been another solution, then we could have negotiated with AQIM, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, because that is what they want. They want a borderless Ummah in the Sahel. But I mean, that is not going to happen. So I mean, it's sort of this problem. I mean, it starts and stops with the state, and we need to become better at dealing with the states and dealing with in the case of Mali, which is this enormous problem of state building. It's okay. I mean, the institution building may be sort of the European Union expertise, but I mean, it's extremely difficult to design institutions for other people. Basically, I mean, the only people who can build working institutions in Mali are the Malians themselves. And we need to become better at is sort of identifying and facilitating and creating some sort of autonomous space for coalitions of those that have an eagerness to reform, but also those that have a reform ability. And right now, I mean, if you are working with anybody, it's sort of only people with a willingness to reform. The will is not enough. We need to work with actors that also has the ability to orchestrate reform and see how we can work on the incentive structures around these groups of people. What you need then, and what I think the EU is basically completely lacking in these kind of cases, is detailed, grounded micropolitical analysis. And I have not seen much of that at all. There is a lot of mandate and doctrine development that comes out of Brussels, but what is way too little of is an uptake of experiences actually made in the field. And this is a huge problem that the EU seriously needs to start addressing. Yeah. If I may, just give me 10 seconds on this, on the issue of Ukraine and lessons learned and so on. I find it quite astonishing that the issue of, in all these debates about Ukraine and what could be done and so on and so forth, that very few people talk about the so-called Finnish solution and the whole concept of the Nordic balance that worked wonders in the relationships between the Nordic countries, NATO, and the Soviet Union. I mean, one seems to be stuck in one paradigm of dealing with this. This would be an alternative. Go back and reread the old literature on the Nordic balance. Unfortunately, even the Nordic countries have forgotten this. They have forgotten that there was two ways of doing this. It was deterrence, but also calmness and calming things down. That would be my suggestion.
Thank you. I did, but I'm geek. I read it. Thank you. Enver, no.
Again, there is no clear-cut answer. Obviously, the European Union frames geopolitically its approach to all of these countries. Neighborhood, accession, extended neighborhood, all of this already indicates it's Eurocentristic. We look at the world from a European perspective. That's how we deal with all these countries. But in terms of normative projection and then specifically the skills, the added value of European Union missions and then also different instruments applied, I think we do have a lot to offer. These countries actually do need our help, and we do actually deploy lots of resources and staff into these countries. And lots of the people, I mean myself, Kurt asked the right questions, so is it a self-serving exercise? Are all of these just there to raise the European flag and show actually we do matter, we do something? I think it's more than that. The answer is basically it's a mixed answer. We do have impact on the ground. It's very, very difficult to quantify it. Very often the numbers do not do justice to the work that's being done and the impact that we actually leave on the ground. I think all of these three cases show actually that our work is appreciated, and the populations of these countries reflect on our presence. To a certain degree, never know actually what we're doing, because we also make sure that we package it in such wordings that it's very difficult to trace back what we do. But ultimately, also coming from my side, not only as a researcher, but also as a practitioner for many years, having been deployed to these crisis areas, I have to say we do actually do really meaningful work, and in the end, there is lots of stuff that's being left behind. So ultimately, how do you ensure that sustainability and local ownership take over? I mean, these are things we try. I mean, it's not only been tried by development people, and it comes to even more demanding SSR there is no guarantee that any of the things that you basically leave behind next year or even next month will not completely fall apart. In terms of funding, in terms of personnel, I mean, you have no guarantee for these things. But ultimately, I think there is certainly an added value to the EU engagement. So let's make sure that we improve accountability and delivery of our efforts.
Thank you, and thank you for ending the panel on a more positive note than we had from the very onset. Before we thank to our speakers at this panel, I would like to announce the closing remarks that will take place right now. So do not leave your seats. Mr. Bøås and Ms. Pernille Rikker will be giving some closing notes after hearing this morning and this afternoon session. But before that, I will just say that it was a great pleasure to chair this session and to thank our speakers. Thank you.
I think this has. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to close this this first academic event, opening the Belgrade Security Forum. I think it has been very interesting. First of all, starting out with Professor Roger McGinty's keynote speak, defining or discussing how to define the locals, which I think is very important, and also the two panels where we have had some findings from the different case studies. So my name is Pernille Rikker. I am also involved in this project, EU Unpack, as a project leader for the work package 4 on EU institutions and decision making. And I will start this closing remark, and then Morten Bøås, who is the project leader, will end with a few additional remarks. I would also like to thank the two, because we had two papers that were not part of this project, and I think it was interesting to see how well they fitted in, and also that they broadened the perspective and gave some additional insights to the other papers. So I have a PowerPoint that you can follow. So I will go a little bit back. When closing these remarks, I will go a little bit back to the starting point of this project. And I go back to which is my field, really EU studies. Because for many years, the academic literature on the EU's engagement in external conflicts and crises has mostly been, or was mostly concerned with EU's actorness, what kind of actor the EU is. And there's been different views on this. The EU has been labeled soft power, smart power, civilian power, normative power, transformational power, as we mentioned earlier, cosmopolitan power, superpower, and some have also called it a small power. So while more attention over the kind of last years, last decade maybe, has been given to the actual implementation of Union's policy, this research continues, in my view, to be guided by a rather specific theoretical or normative agenda. So the aim of our project, the EU Unpack project, has been to break free from these labels and perspectives and then unpack EU crisis response. And this has been done, as you have heard from the different panels, through an inductive and systematic empirical research combining competences from peace and conflict studies with insight from EU studies. And I think this is kind of a new thing, because EU studies and peace and conflict studies has been very separate fields in international relations, and I think this is an added value of this project. But another added value, which is important and which maybe was not in the focus, or which was not presented clearly in the first panel, is that we have also had participation from local partners in all when studying the conflict. So we have actually had, I would say, managed to have a bottom-up perspective to a larger degree than many other previous projects on studying EU crisis response. Is that the right? No, maybe I forgot to. Is that the two potential gaps? Okay, thank you. Okay, so we have. We started out studying what we call the two potential, we identified these two potential gaps in EU crisis response, and it's very much inspired, of course, by Christopher Hill's concept of expectation capability gap in CSDP. But we have tried to kind of be a little bit more specific on what these gaps are all about. So we divided the gaps into the first gap between intention and implementation, as you have heard, and the other between implementation and local reception. So the first gap, then we asked this question: does the EU have the capacity to make decisions and respond with one voice and to deploy the necessary resources? How are these responses implemented on the ground by various EU institutions and member states? Do other actors, local and international, enhance or undermine EU's activities? And when it comes to the second gap, does the EU have the capacity to be conflict sensitive or taking local stakeholders' views and competences into account? So our argument from the start of the project was that the severity of these two gaps will give us an indication of EU's impact on crisis management, and also then its ability to contribute more effectively to problem solving on the ground. So that was the starting point, and now we'll try to present some of the key findings from all these different case studies. Of course, we have heard the different case studies being presented, the different findings in the different cases, but I think there also are some general findings that we can refer to. The first is, I haven't changed. I think I am at case. Thank you for helping me out. It's difficult to see. I'm there, I think. Okay, so the first finding is that I think it's important to say, even though that we have been focused on the gaps or the lack of progress in EU capacities for crisis response, I think it's also important to mention that progress has been made. I mean, the EU has improved its capacity to act in crisis significantly over the past 20 years. So we have also to have that in mind, that the EU is still a rather young actor in this field. But still, sorry, then I was a bit quick. Still, these two gaps are also far from being plugged. So what is the main problem and what can be done? So let's look at the first gap, the intention implementation gap first. As I said, this gap is already getting smaller and smaller, and the EU has improved its capacity to respond to crisis. But our research revealed that the remaining challenges are linked to a set of different factors, and we'll try to go through some of these factors here. The first is actually that the EU has also now higher ambitions than before. So the intentions, on the intention side, it's much higher, especially after having a goal of developing a comprehensive approach or integrated approach. This is, of course, very complex and difficult to implement. This kind of integrated approach, taking into account all the different tools and capacities of the EU. So this is one important factor. But the other thing is also that the EU has quite limited resources. And they also have problems of using the resources that they have in an effective manner. We have also seen that there is some kind of slow implementation, of course, linked to what you all know is a very slow decision-making capacity of the EU. So the EU has, as we have heard, is often being in many crises more reactive than proactive. We have also heard that the EU, there are competing interests between the EU and other institutions in the field, but also between the EU and the member states that are actually engaged in the conflicts at the same time, which also is confusing for the locals, of course, and it can also produce negative results in the end. There is also lack of institutionalized procedures for lessons learned and best practices, horizontal learning. We see some progress has been made in this area when it comes to CSDP, but when it comes to integrated approach as such, we see that in all other areas there is a lack of these institutionalized procedures. And the last thing is that we see a lack of coordination and division of labor with other actors on the ground. And as an example from Mali, and I guess also other examples, is that we see that the locals, there are some kind of training fatigue because there are so many actors in doing more or less the same thing. So this is also a challenge. Concerning the implementation perception gap, here we see that this gap has not actually been narrowed at all. From the various case studies, we have learned that conflict sensitivity is not really a key concern of the EU. It is not really referred to, and if it is referred to, it's very superficial. It's more ticking of a box because, as Bård also mentioned in his keynote speak, it has become a buzzword. It is something that you kind of have to relate to, but which is often not filled with real content. And this is something that we have also seen, and is also confirmed by a study that we have done using a methodology called text mining web scraping. We have gone through a large number of EU documents using a software trying to see what kind of words that pop up in EU documents together with the crisis. So when talking about Ukraine, talking about Mali and the EU's engagement, what kind of words are the EU using in the different documents? And here we have seen that conflict sensitivity or other words linked to that local ownership local ownership and local engagement is not really referred to at all. Very little to very low extent. But studying the language used in connection to the different crises, we managed to identify the union's kind of repertoire or toolbox in crisis response, and that this corresponds to three different agendas. What we call a hard security agenda, a soft security agenda, or an integration agenda. When it comes to the hard security agenda, this was linked very much to the words such as border management, migration, security, stability, crime, trafficking, and sanctions. The more softer security agenda of the EU is more linked to words such as civil society, good governance, rule of law, dialogue, humanitarian aid, and development aid. And finally, the integration agenda is linked to words like integration, enlargement, membership, conditionality, and association agreements. And when we looked at this over time, from 2000 to 2018, we see very clearly that there is a trend towards an increased attention to security over integration in both the enlargement and the neighborhood area, and that corresponds very well with the findings, I think, in the papers that have been presented here. And in the wider neighborhood, in cases like Mali, Afghanistan, Iraq, there is also a tendency that hard security is taking over from kind of the softer security measures. So we see in many ways that there is in general, a stronger focus in all regions on security concerns, and these concerns also tend to undermine other concerns, including conflict sensitivity. So now we'll move to the preliminary conclusions. It seems in many ways that the main emphasis of the EU has been institutions and capacity building, and this was also mentioned this morning. So strengthening the actorness of the EU has been kind of the main concern, rather than obtaining lasting results on the ground. And I think that this is still the case, and with the current also geopolitical context that we are living in, this is also so strengthening this trend with increased focus on short-term security measures rather than long-term stability. So even if the EU has improved its capacity to act over the past 20 years, the main focus has been on capacity building, the actorness, developing the EU as a global actor, and we see that also the short-term security measures seem to trump long-term stability measures, and also including conflict sensitivity. But to end on a positive note, I think that the fact that EU NPAC was funded, I mean, this shows that the EU is interested in improving its crisis response capacity. And I think that it's also important when you have an actor that are willing to adapt, it's also easier to come up with suggestions. And I think that this is actually, it's possible, as Morten said, also it's possible to come up with some suggestion of how to adapt the policy, making the policy at the same time taking into account that the EU has to be concerned with short-term security measures as well, and the geopolitical context is not changing rapidly, as we see. But I think that to have these kind of conflict sensitivity and local engagement, also take that into account, is important. The tricky thing for us, I think, in the last part of the project is to try to translate what Roger said this morning, how to understand the locals in a better way, and to transfer that into concrete policy advice. I think that will be the challenge for the last part of the project. And then I give the floor to Morten.
Thank you, Pernille. And I mean, I agree with you that the EU has improved. There is no doubt about that. My question is whether it really is fit, if it has improved so much that it really is fit for the future of, if not the coming, at least the making of what to me almost looks like a perfect storm on the very borders of Europe. And that is the situation we find in parts of North Africa and the Sahel, where the combination of weak and most often quite illegitimate governments together with an enormous population increase. That's the big elephant in the room that nobody wants to talk about. We believe that, and I stress believe, that the Malian population right now is around 18 millions. We really don't know how many who live there, but we believe it's 18 millions. We know the birth rate of Malian women. That means that this population is likely to double in size around 2040, 2050. I have no idea what these 50 million people are going to live off and from. And neither has anybody else. Anybody who says that they have the answer to this question, they are simply lying. This is if you then combine that with active jihadist insurgencies, quite a lot, many people have given up on their own country and simply want to move away because they see no future there. And the climate change that is coming. I don't believe that we are anywhere near of reaching that goal of only an increase in 1.5 in global temperature. We are probably closer to dawning in on something between 2 and 4, which means that large parts of the Sahel, given the current production system, will become unlivable. This is the perfect storm that we are facing, and which Europe and the EU quickly needs to start adapting to, because we need to find answer to these kind of problems, which means that we would have to see crisis response on a much larger level and with much higher efficiency than we have seen today. And then the trick for the EU is to become better at both understanding and learning. The EU needs to become better at learning from its mistakes, but it also needs to become much better at learning from when it does the right thing. I mean, for me, an obvious example of this, this is not EU NPAC related. I mean, this is something that that I worked on in between 2005 and 2007. I worked a lot in northern Uganda with the war, the Lord's Resistance Army Rebellion, and the humanitarian crisis, where you had 90% of the population locked up in prison like IDP camps. The EU was really driving better policies here. And they also funded 2 large IDP profiling studies that I was responsible for. Wonderful to work with that current delegation. Then, 2007, change of head of delegation, and everything collapsed. Everything collapsed. They lost all the impact that they had. It's so people-dependent parts of this. And there was absolutely no transfer of neither programs nor approaches nor lessons learned in that period. And we see this the same today. I mean, in places like Mali, Iraq, Afghanistan, for example, I mean, the turnover of staff is so rapid. And it's mostly most of those that are in fact sitting on this. I'm not here talking about heads of delegation, but who are supposed to do this are very junior staff, who are in there for sometimes, in the case of Bamako, someone doesn't stay more than between 6 to 12 months. Meaning that they start to get some grip of things and then they leave again. And there doesn't seem to be any really good procedures of transferring knowledge. And there needs to become much better at transferring knowledge from the ground and back to Brussels. Right now, this is way too top-down. It's all dependent upon how Brussels thinks that the world looks like. And if Brussels is to become fit for the future, this type of future, Brussels needs quickly to realize that the rest of the world does not look nor does it work as Brussels do. So there are still some substantial challenges here that the EU quickly needs to find a way of becoming much better at working at, in my point of view. And it also needs to become much better at really understanding how these countries actually work, how these states actually work. Where you simply cannot look at some sort of organizational map of a place like Mali or Afghanistan and say that this is where power is located. Power and authority is located in between the various spaces of the state and these strange things that we call civil society, whatever that means in these kind of places. These are some of the challenges. So I think that, yes, in some of most of its policies today on crisis response, I mean, they look sort of up to date on paper. But the challenge is now to start really translating this into systematic, meaningful, and sustainable policies that actually works. And here, I mean, the EU is not doing any worse than other large, similar large organizations. I mean, the World Bank is struggling with this. The huge bilateral, the huge stakeholders like UK, Germany, France. I mean, everybody's struggling with this. But it needs to become, also in the Union, a much more concerted action on these kind of issues. So, I mean, in sum, I mean, I think that the EU has improved, but it needs to improve rapidly now to be able to become fit for a possible future that doesn't look very good, actually. This is the challenge, and that work needs to start immediately. I believe that in the case of the Sahel, there is a window of opportunity, 10 to 15 years. If you are not able to deal with some of these huge challenges in the next 10 to 15 years, that window will close, and then God knows what will happen. God knows what will happen in this region, but also God knows how this will affect Europe if you see a major collapse just across the Mediterranean. So these are some of the challenges we are faced with. I mean, I'm very happy that we got this funding from the Union. It's been marvelous to work on this, and also for me. I mean, I have had a lot to do with the EU, and I met the EU in many places around the world where I have been working. But I was not an EU expert when this started. I'm not an EU expert now when we come towards the end of this. But I do believe that the conversation that we have been able to have in EU and PAC across various approaches, across also some normative positions that we take, has been very useful. And I think that it proves that you need more than one perspective if you are to understand something as complex as this. We need people like Pernille who has that detailed understanding and knowledge of how the EU works, but I would say that you also need people like me and Roger who comes with a other sort of more critical peace conflict perspective, where we at least try to work as bottom up as possible. And I think that EU NPAC has showed that we can deliver on some of these issues, and we can deliver something meaningful. And it's also been a wonderful opportunity to work with so many incredibly good researchers around the world who, and I'm very impressed with everybody that we have worked with, but here I just would like to single out, I mean, the people that we work with on the ground in Bamako, in Erbil, and Kabul, who's doing fantastic empirical work under extremely difficult circumstances in a security setting where things are at times extremely dangerous. So I would very much like to sort of put that on record and appreciate the efforts of everybody who has been involved in that, and also take the opportunity to thank Sonia, who managed to bring us together here. So with this, I believe that Sonia is now signaling to me that I should shut up, and we are closing this session. So, but thank you to everybody who has been with us for the whole day, and thanks for comments and interventions and helping us improving our research and our research findings.